The rain hasn't stopped for 71 days. It used to be something people prayed for, an answer to droughts, to cracked soil and dying crops. Now it's a curse that never ends. The sky leaks endlessly, a gray wound that refuses to heal. It's not the kind of rain that soothes or nourishes. It's acidic, cold, and heavy, stinging the skin if you're foolish enough to step outside without protection. It carries the smell of rust, smoke, and something else, something metallic and bitter, like the aftertaste of a dying world. They say it began with the bombs, but the truth is, the world was already sick long before the first missiles hit. The wars just finished what humanity had started. When the skies turned red over Europe and the satellites went blind, no one knew who had fired first. Some say it was an accident, a misread signal buried in corrupted code. Others say it was deliberate, a final show of dominance from nations that no longer exist. Whatever it was, the atmosphere changed overnight. Now the horizon is a colorless smear. The sun tries to break through sometimes, but it never does. It's like it's trapped behind layers of ash and rain clouds, struggling to remember what warmth used to mean. The nights are worse, endless storms, the sky flashing with silent lightning that doesn't even make sound anymore. Just a white pulse across the clouds, followed by the soft percussion of rain striking what's left of civilization. The cities drowned first. Floods took what the bombs didn't. Subways became rivers, streets became canals filled with debris and bodies that no one had time to bury. The rich fled to the mountains, or underground, or into orbit if the rumors are true. The rest of us stayed, or tried to. Now the old cityscapes lie half buried in mud, their steel skeletons jutting from the earth like bones of extinct giants. I walked through what used to be downtown once. Couldn't recognize it. The skyline that had once glowed with 1,000 lights was nothing but dark spires wrapped in vines and smoke. Street signs peeled, storefronts collapsed, windows shattered by years of storms. Nature didn't reclaim it with beauty, it reclaimed it with violence. The trees that grew back were twisted, their bark blackened, roots thick with contamination. The animals that roam the ruins are barely recognizable, muted colors, thinner, hungrier. They look like the ghosts of their species, surviving on whatever refuses to die. The government doesn't exist anymore, not in any way that matters. There are still broadcasts, faint signals that break through the static sometimes, automated emergency messages on loop, repeating words like containment, quarantine, radiation. No one listens. The machines that made those announcements are probably underwater by now. The real power belongs to those who can protect or take or hoard. Survivor groups formed early on, then turned on each other just as quickly. Food became currency, fuel became myth, and clean water became worth killing for. There are trade routes now, if you can call them that, half-drowned highways patrolled by scavengers who barter in bullets and lies. No one travels far. The weather alone makes sure of that. Temperatures swing without reason. 1 week you freeze solid, the next, the air feels like breathing through fire. The rain never stops, but the rivers are poisoned, and the lakes glow faintly at night. Everywhere you can still hear the remnants of the old world, sirens that malfunction endlessly, automated drones flying in broken patterns, blinking red lights in the fog as if waiting for orders that will never come. Sometimes at night, you can hear music. Not live, not human. Just old radio transmissions bouncing off the atmosphere, replaying the same songs people used to dance to before the war. They sound warped, slow, like echoes of a dream that refuses to fade completely. Most people don't stay in one place anymore. They drift. Camps rise and fall like the tides. I heard there are still strongholds somewhere inland, places with working filtration systems and hydroelectric power, but no one I've met has ever seen them. Some say they're just propaganda, the last illusion of safety designed to keep us searching. Others swear they've been there to clean domes under glass skies, guarded by soldiers with oxygen masks and rifles that hum. But out here, where the rain never stops, we live differently. We live by instinct. Find shelter, stay dry, stay quiet. Fire draws attention. Noise gets you killed. There are others out there wandering, not all of them human anymore. Exposure to the fallout, the toxins, the prolonged storms, it changes people. Skin grays, eyes cloud, minds fracture. I've seen one up close once. He didn't look like a monster. He looked tired, like he'd just forgotten what being human meant. Sometimes when the wind shifts, you can smell the ocean, even though it's miles away. It smells wrong now, sharp and chemical. The tides are rising higher each month, swallowing what's left of the coastlines. There's talk of islands vanishing, entire nations gone beneath the waves. No one's seen a map in years that wasn't hand-drawn or outdated. The satellites that used to track the world's weather fell silent long ago. And yet, beneath the despair, there's a strange calm. The rain hides everything, your footsteps, your breathing, your fear. It feels like the world itself is trying to lull you to sleep, whispering through the storm, rest now, it's over. But it's not over, not yet. Somewhere beyond the static, beyond the broken cities and flooded fields, something still stirs, something still human. Maybe that's why I keep recording. Maybe that's why I keep speaking into this old transmitter, hoping someone somewhere is still listening through the rain. I remember my name less often now. Names felt important once, anchors to jobs, to birthdays, to people you promise things to. They make it harder to accept the loss, so I use them when I have to, for official lists, for the moments I speak to someone and want to sound like a person, not a ghost. Most days I answer to the soft crackle of the transmitter, to the rhythm of the rain on corrugated steel, to the small inventions that keep me breathing. Before the rain and the blasts, I was an engineer, not the glamorous kind you see in movies, a maintenance engineer for municipal systems. Pumps, valves, backup generators. My hands learned to listen to machines the way some people learn to listen to music. That skill saved me. When the world started to unthread, I stitched seams with wire and duct tape and stubbornness. It's how I learned to coax a 60-year-old diesel generator into coughing out a dozen hours of power for my little camp. It's how I taught myself to read circuit diagrams by flashlight and jury-rig solar panels from panes ripped from skyscraper atriums. Survival is a lot of small, practical things strung together. You learn them one at a time. How to rig a rain catcher and funnel the acidic runoff through charcoal and filter cloth until it becomes something you'll risk calling water. How to patch a leaky fuel drum so it doesn't turn into a slow-burning argument. How to strip wiring from a ruined building without collapsing a wall you'll later need for shelter. I keep a notebook with lists because my memory is a sieve. The notebook has water stains now and edges curled like old leaves, but it holds recipes for sterilizing a wound, a crude map of safe routes around patrols, and the names I can still bring myself to say. People ask for precise recipes, and I'll give them because what I know could save a life. We boil when we can. We use iodine tablets when the rain tastes wrong and charcoal filters when the rivers glow at night. There are tricks. Lemon juice and salt for cleaning, a pinch of baking soda when the stomach revolts, how to make a tincture from willow bark when the aspirin runs out. None of it is glamorous. None of it is certain. Most of the time it's enough to get another day. What keeps me is smaller than duty and bigger than survival. It's the idea that someone might be listening when I switch on the transmitter. That tiny possibility that somewhere in the hush between storms, a human ear might press to an old radio and pull my voice out of the static. That is the thin cord that tethers me to this life. The broadcasts began as a way to record locations of clean wells, caches, and safe routes. They were practical. They were maps drawn in sound for people who no longer had paper. Somewhere along the way they became confessions, songs, lullabies for the living and the dead. I tell stories now the way I used to fix leaky valves, firmly, with the same hands, the same patience. Loss is an undercurrent. I lost someone first to the drought before the bombs, a stubborn, simple death that left me hollowed out. Later came the nights of fire and the mornings when neighbors could no longer stand on their porches, because standing required more than the skeleton of a person was allowed. I remember standing over a bed of ash once and thinking it was a joke of light, a trick of the wind. Names pile up, faces become weather. Sometimes guilt sits on my chest with the weight of the sky and squeezes until I can barely breathe. I have not forgiven myself for enough things to fill a ledger. Decisions to leave, decisions to stay, the choices that left others exposed while I clung to a generator and a can of beans. There are people who travel with me sometimes. A quiet woman who taught me how to splice fiber optic cabling into a radio loop. A teenager who can charm a wild dog into following him like an orphaned pup. Mostly, though, I move alone. Loneliness is not the absence of people. It's the constant inventory of what you can offer and what you have to take. I barter stories for medicine and jokes for canned peaches. Human connection is rationed like food, precious and hoarded, and given only when it might return something. My body carries the weather. The acid rain has nicked away at skin and patience. My hands are rough as old bark, cracked in places that ache with each temperature swing. I wake most mornings with the phantom ache of neighbors gone. I carry a small keepsake, a warped wristwatch that no longer tells time, but I wind anyway. It gives me a rhythm. It gives me the comforting illusion that there are hours left to occupy. Ritual matters. I oil the generator at dusk. I check the radio at dawn. I scrape mold from the corners of canned goods with a long spoon and a prayer. People ask why I stay in the ruined city when the rumor lines point inland to strongholds and clean domes. The truth is complicated. Cities keep things, not all of them ruined. Libraries become storehouses of paper and knowledge. The old hospital basements hide shelves of antibiotics if you're willing to dig, and to listen to the groan of metal under floodwater. My home is not a home so much as a map scabbed together from scavenged signs and memory. It is a repository of small treasures, a spool of copper wire, a sealed jar of instant coffee, a child's toy truck I found by a collapsed supermarket. They feel like evidence that the world once included things worth protecting. I've learned to measure people in how much they are willing to risk. Trust is a traded commodity. I have trusted once too often, and paid for it by watching a camp torch itself because we couldn't hide the warm light of a cooking fire. Trust is also a tool. I've had to use people's need for companionship to thread alliances, sharing parts, information, roots. That's not false kindness, that's survival sewn with human thread. The best alliances are the ones where both sides leave with something they couldn't get alone. There are days when I want to stop recording, when the voice on the transmitter feels like it belongs to someone else who wears my face, when the radio plays back my own exhaustion, and I don't like how it sounds. But then there are nights when a reply comes through, a stuttered, static-laced voice from the Northwest saying, "We heard you. Keep talking." Those two words are enough to make the generator worth the oil, to make the rain feel like a curtain behind which something human still exists. I carry guilt and gratitude in equal measure. Gratitude for the skills that let me keep a lantern glowing for a small circle of people. Gratitude for the luck that lets me find a can of corn when bellies rumble. Guilt for the time I left a well-meaning convoy behind because their needs exceeded what I could give. I've learned the hard balance of sharing, enough to keep hope breathing, not so much that hope dies. To survive in this world you must be a technician and a liar and a comforter all at once. I mend a pump and invent a lie to keep a frightened child quiet when raiders approach. I teach someone to filter rainwater knowing I might not have enough to give them the whole truth about what's left. I can fix a radio and tell a story. Those are my trades. Sometimes, when the rain's rhythm slows to a whisper between storms, I let myself remember the old things with a clarity that stings. The smell of fresh coffee in an office break room, the sunlight through a train window, a laugh that lifted the roof off a small apartment. Memory is dangerous. It makes the present sharper and the absence duller. But memory is also instruction. It reminds me that people can be more than survivors. They can be artists, lovers, liars, comedians, and saints. We had 1,000 rolls before the world pared us down to lungs and hunger. I hope to collect enough of those rolls in my broadcasts to remind anyone listening that the human catalog still exists. I keep an open channel because hope is a strange, stubborn organ. People imagine it huge and theatrical, a new city rising, a cure discovered, governments reconstituted. For me, hope is small and practical. A can of beans that doesn't taste like metal, a child who laughs, a radio response that says simply, "I heard you." That's the kind of hope that scaffolds a life where there is little left to build. So I speak. I tell the coordinates of wells and the stories of the dead. I share recipes and jokes and the names I remember. I repair, I barter, I listen. And when the rain drums on the roof and the world seems intent on erasing us, I keep the transmitter warm between my hands and whisper into the static like it's a pillow. We are here. The crisis began like a slow fever and then exploded into a rash that covered everything. We had warnings, models and graphs and politicians who mumbled about extreme events. But warnings are paperwork until they become weather at your doorstep. In my world, the warning lines blurred into one another. Droughts that turned into dust storms, heat waves that birthed wildfires. And then, when the world was already raw, the war. The detonations didn't just break concrete. They ripped open atmospheres that had already been sick. Soot and ash rode the jet stream and settled on ice. The ice, in turn, stopped reflecting sun and started holding heat. The ocean warmed in layers, and the weather went mad. What we're living through is not a single catastrophe. It's a stacked disaster. Nuclear exchange on top of a planet already destabilized by greenhouse gases. Wildfires that pump so much particulates into the air they seed long, wet storms, and oceans that refuse to behave. The rain, the acid, slow, unending rain that drums on my shelter, comes from chemical reactions in the air. Nitrogen oxides and sulfur compounds bind with water vapor and fall back to us as something that burns slowly. It eats metal and human patience in equal measure. It's the kind of rain that will clean dirt off a tin can and leave a new taste of metal on your tongue. It makes the soil sour. It ruins the pumps. It ruins the pumps' gaskets, their electrical contacts, everything mechanical that relies on metal staying. Ordinary. Survival gets harder every day because of the compound effects. Food production collapsed first in many places. You can't plant in soil that's been stripped of nutrients and drenched by acid. Crops that do germinate are vulnerable to the new pests and to extreme temperature swings, cold nights after blistering days. Pollinators that used to do their job are gone or mutated. Fisheries collapsed as warmer surface water stratified and killed the oxygen layers below. Then the social systems fall apart. Distribution networks, trucks, fuel, ports stop functioning. Refrigeration dies. Medicine becomes a luxury. Antibiotics are hoarded like gemstones and then spilled when patrols raid a convoy. I see the science in the small every day, not as charts but as consequences. When you work with pumps, you learn to measure flow and pressure. Those numbers tell you when a river's feeding less because upstream snowpack failed, when a well is drawing from a poisoned layer. I keep a log, flow rates, color changes, pH readings I approximate with strips scavenged from a lab kit to know if something is usable. The pH of the rain matters. If it's below about 5.0, you start having to neutralize before using it for anything but washing. If it's closer to 3.0, metal corrodes quickly, and plants will die where they touch the soil. I've seen a rooftop garden collapse within a month because the irrigation used nothing but raw runoff. There are people who became scientists in the catastrophe, the ones who still try to track the mechanics and make plans. I met one of them on a supply run, a woman who kept a cracked tablet full of satellite images and course-corrected climate models. She taught me a few things I didn't want to hear and a few that mattered. The atmosphere is full of particulate matter now, soot from fires, dust from deserts newly created, and fallout from detonations. Those particles act like a sunshade, but in an uneven way, cooling some regions and heating others. That's why storms park in place for weeks. The jet stream has changed course. Rossby waves have grown lazy and stall, and when a big moisture feed gets trapped beneath a blocking high, it becomes a long, slow siege. People respond the way people always do, some with compassion, some with cruelty. We used to call them raiders. Now they're just scavengers who organize themselves into gangs with names and flags and teeth. They ride patched-up vehicles with armor made from shopping carts and metal sheets, and they patrol the old highways looking for soft targets. Others became merchants of a cruel sort. They'd trade medicine for labor and then turn around and hoard the laborers' children as bargaining chips. Hope makes for terrible economies when the currency is human need. I had 2 close encounters that changed how I operate. The first was with a convoy of so-called cleaners, a group that claimed to be rebuilding order. They came with uniforms and a dictionary of laws, and they spoke with the tone of men who had read too many manuals and felt righteous. They set up a checkpoint near a water source and demanded a tithe. We argued, badly, and a firefight erupted over who would take water and who would watch the engines. In the end, my camp lost a neighbor named Omar, who taught me to thread copper wire like a perfumer reads scent. Omar refused to hand over the last drum of diesel. He chose to light the wick on a fuse he'd hidden. He did not want their rules in our heads. I buried him in 3 rain-soaked shovelfuls of earth and said the words that seemed to help. Don't let them take your name. Sometimes, names save you from desolation. The second encounter was gentler and more dangerous because it involved trust. A group of 3 arrived at dawn, 2 adults and a frightened child. They smelled of salt and illness as if the sea had been trying to get them back. The woman, not much older than me, had a satchel of instruments, pH strips, a hand-cranked centrifuge, and a note that a lab still existed 40 miles inland with filtration membranes, and a person who remembered how to run them. I wanted to believe. I still want to believe. We bartered clean batteries for their maps. For 2 weeks we pooled work, pooled water, and the little camp hummed with something like hope. Then the raiders came, tipped by someone who wanted our batteries, and the camp split like old wood. The woman left at dusk with the kid, leaving behind the centrifuge. I could have gone with them. I sat on the generator and listened to the rain and decided the transmitter and I would stay. The resources are finite and often poisoned. Clean water is the obvious one, but fuel matters in ways that are less visible. Fuel moves goods and people. Fuel powers pumps that pull groundwater from depths that are still clean. Fuel runs the few desalination units someone managed to keep alive. Batteries store power for radios and small lights. Each of these is a hinge for 1,000 human tasks. Without fuel, you can't farm easily. Without batteries, you can't talk long range. Without clean water, you can't keep infections from killing a community. I ration all of those as if they were lives themselves. There are tricks that buy time. For water, basic filtration, sand, gravel, cloth, removes particulates. Activated charcoal from a campfire will take out some organics and foul tastes. Boiling kills most pathogens. When the rain is acidic, you can raise the pH with crushed limestone or a pinch of baking soda, then filter. Solar stills can pull some potable water from brackish sources. They're slow but reliable when other options fail. For fuel, conserve, convert, and scavenge. We trade solar panels when we can. I rigged a pedal generator from an old exercise bike that gives me enough to charge a radio and a headlamp. To desalinate and scale, you need a pressure-driven system or a working reverse osmosis membrane, both rare. So we prioritize. Hospital pumps first, then communication, then lighting. Food is grown in micro-gardens under salvage greenhouse plastic, composted carefully, rotated so you don't exhaust the barely their nutrients. Seed banks are treasures, but many of them were not built for this level of mutation and failure. Medical supplies are the quietest crisis. A cut on the road that would have been a week's inconvenience before now becomes a month's worry. Tetanus, infections, and respiratory problems from contaminated air take fewer hosts to become deadly. We improvise antiseptics, use honey for its antibacterial properties when sugar is more abundant than saline, and rely on herbs for pain where real analgesics are gone. I keep a small stock of antibiotics, not because I'm a hoarder, but because once you use them on one person, you may not be able to replace them. That choice hangs on the inside of my skull like a barometer reading. Science still has a role, if only to make better choices. Understanding the mechanics of the storms gives you roots. Knowing where the thermocline shifts in a nearby river tells you which pumps are worth risking. Recognizing patterns in raider movement, supply lines that get stronger around new harvests, lets you plan harvest times for small fields. We learn to read the wind and the birds' odd migrations, and to watch ice melt and refuse to be surprised by it. Knowledge, practical and applied, is survival currency. But there's an emotional science, too. The way fear compounds and then hardens into cruelty if not checked by ritual or companionship. The more afraid a group, the faster it claws inward. Cruelty can look like efficiency, strict discipline around distribution, public punishments to keep people in line, but it eats the long tail of recovery. Rebuilding requires trust, and trust is the longest resource to recoup. Currently, the immediate threat pressing on my particular camp is twofold. A stalled storm system that threatens to wash away our last raised garden beds, and a band of organized scavengers who just learned the route where we collect water at night. One can drown you slowly, the other can kill you quickly. We plan for both. We reroute irrigation into covered cisterns to dodge the acid, and we practice silence on the road, moving supplies only at night with muffled wheels. We trade for a cache of wire to reinforce our doors, and a can of solder to mend a pump. And in the small hours, I broadcast coordinates for a known inland filtration site that may or may not still be functioning, because I'll not withhold a chance from anyone who hears it. Crisis is not a single moment for us. It is a cumulative, an accretion of small failures, of the machines that once held society up finally giving way. And yet crisis is also the time for choices. The choices I and others make now, who we trust, how we barter, what knowledge we share, will decide whether more people endure. We are inventors by necessity, but we are still human. That is both a liability and our best tool. We make plans and fail and make new plans. We grieve and then we repair. Tonight the rain is a slow, patient thing, and somewhere in the static I hear the echo of a voice asking if anyone still knows how to mend a membrane. I can't promise miracles. I can promise I will say the coordinates, and if someone answers, I will put them through to the woman with the cracked tablet. That's all we can do sometimes. Open a channel and hope the signal finds a mind as tired and stubborn as ours. The crisis will not be solved by one person or one camp. It will be solved, if it is solved at all, by the small, repeated acts of people choosing to share what they know instead of hoarding it. There is no clean end yet. The storms will come back. The raiders will learn our roots. The pumps will rust. But in the pauses between those beats, we act. We thread copper wire. We pour charcoal into a filter and watch clear water bead into a reclaimed jar. We make tiny, defiant decisions to breathe and to carry on. They say the world tightens like a fist before it lets go. For weeks the hand has been closing. Each day brings a new shortening of the leash. A drum of diesel that lasts 2 weeks instead of 3. A seed packet that refuses to sprout. A ration that weights less when you open it. We learn to count losses in small denominations. Half a liter, 2 batteries, a patch of roof tar. But they add up until you can't breathe around them. It began with the little things this time. The pedal generator that had been my pride for a year, a frame of salvaged steel and an old bike chain, began to stutter when the flywheel warmed. Bearing grease, I thought. I took it apart and found metal flakes in the lubricant like snow. Bearings, worn thin. I had 2 choices. Cannibalize the bearings from Omar's water pump and risk losing the town's ability to pull from the well, or keep the generator and hope someone would trade me a bearing. I took the bearing. Omar's pump hummed more slowly afterward, but we kept the lights long enough to read the map the woman with the cracked tablet had drawn for us. That map is the new obsession for a lot of us. It's a ragged thing on laminated paper, not because it's valuable, but because it looks valuable to others. The woman marked places where filtration membranes might still exist, a desalination unit with a possible intact pressure vessel, a research facility that, if the rumor survived the travel and the hunger, held a working reverse osmosis membrane and someone who knew how to run it. It could be a salvation. It could be a trap. It could be nothing but the dream of people who will believe anything that smells like water. Rumors in this age are either lifelines or traps. They travel fast, braided into gospel by the desperate. Someone always wants to turn them into currency. We heard about a green dome inland last winter, a sealed community with filtered air and a garden for every household. For 3 months people wandered, following hearsay, and for 3 months they returned with fewer hopes and less food. I've met a man who left his sister to join a convoy toward the dome. He came back alone and didn't speak of the road. Another rumor claimed a satellite had survived in orbit and was beaming down maps that would guide survivors to caches. We prayed to that satellite for a month, and then a storm knocked out our receiver, and the prayers collapsed into the rain. The woman with the tablet, Myra, is different because she brings scraps of evidence. She carries satellite charts, crude but real. She knows how to identify a thermocline from a river's glint. She can tell when a pump sound betrays cavitation caused by a failing inlet. But even she is human, and that makes the decisions gnarlier. When she suggested we make a run 40 miles east to a supposed filtration site, she didn't say if, she said when. That when got the town moving. We planned the run the way you lay out a raid. Take an early window when the rain lightens. Move in convoy with parts staggered so a single strike can't cripple all of us. Silence our engines until the last possible moment. Pack into backpacks only what we would die without. The group was small. The fewer bodies, the less of a target. I took the transmitter because if we found something worth broadcasting, someone had to say the coordinates. We took the teenager who could charm animals because his hands were quick and his eyes noticed traps. We took the woman who spliced fiber for us because any data link might be salvaged into something useful. We left the generator running on a low burn, a dim promise of return. The road was a ribbon of wreckage. Trucks pitched into potholes like whales trapped in dried mud. Highway signs leaned like guilty men. We beat through fog and now and then lightning that struck the black trees beside the road and made the trunks sparkle like bone. There were moments when silence felt like a living thing. We could hear our own breath and the rain and nothing else. Then there were moments when other sounds crept in. The metallic tremble of a distant engine, the faint human chorus of someone singing to stay sane. Those were the times I prayed to be invisible. We were not invisible. Raiders shadowed the highway, sliding from ruined overpasses like crows. Their tactics had evolved. They no longer hacked you open out of bloodlust. They took what made you useful and left the rest. Batteries, filters, seeds, maps, those were their groceries. They used nets and small drones rigged from toy parts to scout, and they had radios that could pick up our frequencies if we were sloppy. When they struck, they did it with speed and calculation. Cut power, break comms, take the goods, take the people who could fight. They had learned the calculus of survival. Fewer mouths, more spoils. Our first encounter was a lesson in humility. A small group of them cut across an overpass and closed the road behind us with a spiked barricade. They wore scarves and goggles and carried rifles with barrels scuffed from hard use. They demanded our packs, and a negotiation began that felt like a ritual. We offered them the least important things, rusted spoons, empty tins, while we tried to hide the real goods in false bottoms and sealed jars. The teenager's quick fingers made one false flask that looked like water but was filled with sand. The raider who took it cursed and threw it to the ground. For a moment, I thought our luck would hold. Luck didn't hold. A child in the back of the convoy started to cry, a short, keening sound like a bird hitting a window, and the leader of the raiders seized that noise and punished us for it. He took 2 of our people to make a point, a man who fixed heaters and a woman who knew herbs. They left with them, and the rest of us watched their silhouettes shrink into the storm. We decided that night that bargaining had a cost we could not always bear. We also learned that not all threats wear a mask. Disease moves like wind. In one of the sugar warehouses we raided for grain, a cough traveled through the stacks like a rumor. We left with sacks of flour and a new kind of fear, low-grade fevers and short breaths in the chest. Medicine is short. Antibiotics are rationed. We staged a quarantine that looked like kindness but felt like a sentence. When fever spiked in the night, when a man's breathing turned to sand, we did what we could. Clean wounds, cooled heads with wet cloths, and prayed in our hands for a bottle that might not be there. As resources shrink, moral lines blur. People start making choices they once called unthinkable. We bartered children's shoes for a barrel of kerosene. We traded a portion of a seed bank, seeds that once symbolized future harvests, for a filtration membrane that might give water for a small community for a month. I swallowed shame like a pill. I have made decisions that will follow me to whatever end comes. When the woman who spliced fiber asked me whether saving the membrane was worth the seed packet, I answered mechanically, water first. I could see the ache in her face. The seed packet was for a child she might never have. That night I could not sleep because the answer lodged like a stone. The mystery tightened around us like a noose made of hope. Myra's map looked increasingly like either salvation or bait. She and I scouted the inland route together. The satellite images she carried were patched with annotations and coffee stains. She could point to green smudges where others saw only mud, and convinced me that a cluster of buildings might hide an intact filtration plant. The farther we walked, though, the more the landscape betrayed secrets. We found concrete traps, pits lined with broken glass, signs that someone had deliberately funneled rainwater into poisonous channels, as if to catch anyone foolish enough to drink from it. The world had learned cynicism. The cruel had become architects of deceit. Trust became a knife edge. I wanted to trust Myra because she offered something like science, and science is a language I learned to believe in. But trust is not a thing you can hand over like a tool. It is earned with visible, repeatable acts. When she insisted on taking a side road on the map, one she claimed would shave hours off our march, I watched the faces of the people who followed. I thought of Omar's pump, its weaker hum. I thought of the 2 taken by the raiders. I thought of the child who had cried. I thought of the seed packet in the woman's pack. We followed her down the side road because it was shorter. For a time it seemed like a merciful choice. The rain eased, and the air smelled faintly of cut grass, an illusion of pastoral life that felt like a wound and a mercy at once. Then the field opened, and the world revealed its teeth. A ring of dead trees surrounded a pond that shimmered with an oily film. In the center, trapped like a relic on a pedestal, were the ruins of piping and a corroded tank that might once have been part of a treatment plant. Myra's voice went thin when she saw it. She said softly, "It's not perfect, but it's something." The membrane housings were there, half buried under silt. We laughed with a dead laugh. It was something. It was also a risk. Excavating the site was itself a test. We worked with shovels and a borrowed pump that coughed and refused to start. The teenager dove into the muck and came up with fingers black with oil and a mouth that tasted like metal. We found pipe couplings and a housings for a pressure vessel that might take a new membrane. We found a canister of desiccant that had kept something surprisingly intact. For a week we worked as if we were building the future rather than stealing its corpse pieces. We wired up the old pump with a makeshift belt drive. We learned to brace a sensor with leather so it would not short. We labored in the silence between storms, savoring the small sounds of human hands moving with purpose. And then the raiders found us. Someone had seen the smoke from our little cooking fire or had scouted the road with a drone. They came like vultures with engineering sense. They wanted the pump and they wanted the membranes. They wanted the knowledge that would let them filter water for their own stronghold. We fought. We were clumsy and desperate and brave in that particular combination. The teenager slipped and took a shot in the leg. The raiders took the belt drive and one of the membrane housings and left us with a promise. The next time, they would take everything. We were beaten, but not broken. The membrane housing we smuggled back, hidden under sacks and wrapped in a tarp that smelled like old coffee and ash. The pump we jury-rigged to run on a foot crank and bicycle parts. It was slower, it coughed, but it pulled water. It pulled water with impurities and a bitter tang, but it pulled water that we could neutralize and filter. We celebrated by drinking and not speaking about the missing things. That is how the rise of tension works here. A series of small victories, each purchased with a scab of loss. Supplies ebb, enemies adapt, trust frays and knits again. The mystery of the inland filtration plant moves from rumor to goal to hassle to plan to partial success. With each stage we expose ourselves to weather, to thieves, and to the slippery moral decisions that shape whether we remain human or simply efficient. The internal struggle, the one that roots itself like a parasite in my chest, asks the hardest questions. Should I trust Myra? Is the promise of a filtration plant worth the lives of those who follow me to it? Do I keep the coordinates of other possible clean sites secret to protect them? Or do I broadcast everything and let the world sort itself? When you are the holder of a transmitter, these questions have weight. My words can magnetize people to a place. My silence can doom them to ignorance. Responsibility sits on the tongue like a bitter pill. Sometimes I feel like a traitor to the idea of hope because I must choose who to save. Other times I feel sanctified in a small, private way because I have saved someone for today, and that is the measure of success here. The line between cowardice and prudence thins when bullets fly. I have lied to protect a secret cache. I have told the truth to secure an alliance. I have watched people I loved march away with pacts and promises. I have had to decide whose hands to hold when the fever takes them. As the reins sharpen and the raiders become bolder, as the pump bearings flake and the seed packets thin, we keep moving forward because movement is a kind of defiance. The filter housing we retrieved sits under a tarp in the back of my camp like a promise that whistles when the wind hits it. The teenager walks with a limp and still smiles when he sees a dog pull a cart. Myra sleeps in the radio room and dreams of membranes. I oil the generator every dusk like a priest tending a sacred relic. We are not yet at the breaking point. Maybe that will come tomorrow, when the storm doubles and the raiders ring the camp in a coordinated assault. Maybe it will come when the pump gives up and the last membrane cracks. Maybe it will not come at all, and we will stagger through another season, making small repairs, trading jokes and salt, salvaging dignity inch by inch. Hope is a small thing here. Sometimes a lie we tell ourselves to keep working, sometimes a fact like a membrane housing half exposed in the mud. In the end, the rising action is a test of whether we can keep choosing each other while the world tells us not to. It is the accumulation of choices: to trust, to barter, to fight, to forgive, to leave a bearing on the pump for the next person who might need it more than you. It is the thin architecture of community built from the rubble. The story bends toward a decision point, and that decision will not be made in a single thunderclap, but in 100 small, weary nods. Tonight I tune the transmitter and whisper coordinates into the static for a place that might be real. I tell the frequency what we have found and what we lost. Myra sleeps with maps spread like a tent over her chest. The teenager sharpens a blade by the light. Outside, the rain drums its patient rhythm and the world tightens its fist a little more. We breathe. We prepare. We move. They called it the long pulse, the night when the storm stopped being a background rhythm and turned into a machine that wanted everything. I had heard thunderstorms before that felt like sieves, like the world was straining out its last light. But this one was different. The clouds gathered not with the lazy inevitability I'd learned to read, but with a will. Lightning stitched the sky with slow, mechanical stitches, and the wind smelled of iron and old batteries. It was the kind of weather that makes decisions throbbing and immediate. We were 3 days into trying to resurrect the filtration line. The membrane housings we'd pried from the silt were stubborn relics, but the geometry fit a modern cartridge if you could coax it into place and seal it against collapse. Myra and I worked with headlights and threadbare gloves, cradling gaskets and whispering like midwives. The teenager ferried tools and muttered jokes to steady himself. Outside, the trees shrieked under the push of wind. The pump we jury-rigged, the one that ran off the crank in the bicycle belt, coughing along in the dirt, threatened to unthread 1,000 small plans with one failed bearing. We had one real advantage now, a can of pressure-rated silicone sealant scavenged from a hospital basement, and an old hand pressure tester we could adapt with a bicycle pump. The plan was simple in theory and terrifying in practice. If we could seat a membrane, brace the housing, and slowly bring pressure up to a workable threshold, say 30 to 40 psi, we could start forcing water through the polymer and watch clear beads collect in a sterile jar. It would be slow, precious, miraculous. But to hold that pressure, you needed integrity in the pipework, and a pump that wouldn't cavitate when the inlet starred in a poem of silt and surprise. The first hour looked like mercy. Water that smelled like pennies and old plastic dripped into a jar that we all watched like it held a newborn. Small victories sit in your chest and expand to fill you with a dangerous heat. We cheered soft and stupid and then went back to work, because celebration costs fuel, and fuel is a list of people who will die if you misplace it. When the raiders came, they came like a strategist's idea of punishment. They rolled across the wrecked highway in a patched-up flatbed, the kind of vehicle that looks more like a statement than a car, armor plates welded where an honest builder's hand might have been. They didn't shout at first. They circled and watched, and the radio on the roof hissed a frequency as if to test whether anyone out of line might reply. I saw them through a slit in the tarp, shapes against the rain, breath visible like small lamps. We had a few choices then, and none of them good. We could try to hide the membrane in the mud and hope their search was lazy. We could try to bluff, tell them there was nothing here and let them pry. Or we could stand and show that we had nothing they wanted because we wanted them to see us as the brittle, honest thing we were. I thought of Omar, of the way his hands had smelled of grease and cinnamon. I thought of the teenager's limp, and the woman who carried seeds under her shirt like contraband prayers. I thought of the child Myra had left behind once, the one who'd made her steal her voice for the world. Instead of bargaining, we chose cunning. We would do 2 things at once, keep the membrane and try to pressurize. If they came in force, we planned to open a drain valve and flood the shallow trench around the housings to make the site appear useless. Then roll what we could into tarps and head for the creek. If they attacked in the night, we'd burn the pump to slow them down. It was messy. It was cowardice dressed up as strategy. It was the truth of survival. They hit at dusk. They were patient until the pump began to sing a steady note as pressure rose in the housing. The sound must have carried on the wind because they struck with the coordination of months of practice. A drone buzzed overhead, then a volley of lights flared, and men with rifles appeared along the rise like weeds. The first shots didn't find the pump. They found the bicycle wheel the teenager had left propped against a nail. The wheel shuddered and a spoke exploded like a small, metallic cry. Panic is precise. It is not a blur as people imagine. It is a choreography of tiny, urgent motions. Myra froze for a heartbeat and then moved like an animal trained in the habit of necessity. She slammed a wrench onto the housing, her shoulder knocking a valve closed, her face a map of concentration and fear. The teenager fell, the sound of his body on the ground cutting the night like a poor rhythm. I heard the sizzle of a round through canvas and the smell of burned hair. For a second the world was full of nothing but the rain and the sound of things stopping. In one motion that I did not plan and will never forget, I went for the generator pitch. We had kept the old diesel hidden under a tarp, a small, foul thing that obediently spat smoke when you stroked it. I had enough diesel for maybe 10 minutes at a heavy draw, enough to spin a pressure pump to the level that could keep a membrane flushing while the seals set. That amount of fuel in the wrong hands would have been a feast. In the right hands, it could change everything. I thought in terror and then in clarity. If I run the generator, the raiders will come for the noise and the smoke. If I don't, the membrane will never seat because we need steady flow and pressure to seat it without rupturing. There was a third option I almost didn't dare. Run the generator and make myself visible. Draw them away from the housing so Myra could brute force the seals in relative quiet. I saw Omar's face in that thought, and the watch on my wrist wound tight, ticking like a small accusation. I made the choice that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with what I felt in my ribs. I would make myself a target so others could have a chance. I pulled the tarp, dropped a match on the diesel line, and coaxed the engine awake. It coughed like a sleeping animal, and then found a note and began to sing a small, angry song. Smoke wafted up, black and proud, and the raiders' heads snapped toward it like they'd been called to dinner. Men peeled from the line and headed for the sound. They shouted, and their lights turned the rain into a net of silver threads. Myra didn't look at me, and yet I could feel her eyes. She crawled to the membrane and turned the pressure wheel with hands that shook. She had welded an improvised brace from rebar and a belt. She worked with the kind of tender obsession that I'd seen only twice before. Once when Omar was coaxing a pump into life. Once when my mother had stitched a torn dress by lamplight. The teenager, bleeding and pale, raised a hand feebly at me and smiled like a boy who had found an extra reason to wake in the morning. The generator roared and the pump took the song it needed. Water pooled behind the membrane and then, blessedly, miraculously, began to bead through the polymer. Clear drops, precise as hope, traced into the collection jar. I remember shouting. Maybe it was a laugh, maybe a prayer, because the sight of those drops made the noise of guns recede into something smaller. For a moment the world made sense with the simple geometry of water plus membrane equals drinkable. Then the front line slammed into us. They came up from the channel like storm gods, boots planted in mud, and a man with a rifle the color of old bone shoved his face through the slit in the tarp. His breath was cold and his teeth imperfect. He wanted the generator, the pump, the membranes, everything that made more than noise. He spat words that might once have been demands and now were prophecies. Give it up. We want what keeps you alive. I could have folded. I have folded before and paid for it with Omar's laugh in the distance. Instead, I did the only other thing I still trusted. I lied. I told him there was nothing more. I told him we were busted, that the membrane housings were corroded beyond use, that any sane man would leave. He looked at me like I had a pulse in my throat, and he squeezed the barrel of his gun into the fabric near my ear. The teenager made a sound like a broken hinge. The man moved forward to pry the housing from its seat, and in the same breath I understood that my lie might not hold. People who hear the truth sometimes turn it into a weapon. The raider pried, metal screeched, and for a heartbeat I expected collapse. Instead, the housing held. Myra had seated the gasket with a patience that bordered on sacrament. Pressure that had been rising slowly now steadied into an honest, usable number. The pump sang. Water came, and I saw the raiders' faces change because even scavengers know the shape of clean water when it moves into a jar. That change bought us a sliver of time. Not much time in our world is the width of a fingernail and the tilt of a wrist, but enough. Myra turned and looked at the man in the face and said something that I will not repeat because words like that are complicated and dangerous. The man's jaw worked and then he laughed, a sound without mirth, and walked away with 2 of his men. They left the pump alone because the idea of a functioning line promised them trade, something they could control without burning everything to ash. We had water. It tasted like forgiveness and pennies. We drank and we poured the rest into cunningly hidden jugs. The teenager vomited and then smiled again, because he had drunk something that did not bite his insides. Myra sat with her back against the housing and wept against the rubber seal until her shoulders shook. I sat on the generator, and the engine's heat warmed my hands, and I realized they smelled like diesel and the interior of church pews. The price was immediate. The teenager's wound had been shallow but infected. We had no antibiotics to give him a full chance. The raiders had taken 2 of our people in an earlier strike, and one of those we traded an old sewing machine for. The generator would never be the same. I had pushed it past the margin, and we had burned our last full can of diesel to do it. The membrane was not a miracle. It was a tool with a lifespan, and the knowledge that we needed parts we did not have. But the turning had happened. Water flowed. The camp could rebuild around that jar like a nucleus. People would come to trade and to barter, and some would bring worse things than that. The moral calculus didn't disappear. It simply shifted. We had more to protect now, and protection requires more than a good lie and a stubborn hand. It requires alliances, which we had in delicate, brittle forms. Myra's maps, the teenager's quick hands, my radio voice that could one day call others to a line now capable of producing a few liters an hour. Later, when the rain softened and the raiders' lights slid away into the dark, I sat with my wristwatch and wound it until the spring clicked like a small, private bell. I thought of all the decisions, of choices made in the half-light, and of the people who had been the cost. I thought of Omar and of the woman who had left the child behind, and the child who might yet be alive somewhere because we'd given them a bottle of water that night. I thought of the man with the old bone rifle and the way his laugh had been empty and then full of something else. Perhaps he would come back with more men. Perhaps the membrane would clog and the pump would seize. All of that lay like a risk on the horizon. For once, though, hope had a shape. It was modest, a jar filling with drops that tasted of pennies and promise. It was not a city or a dome or a satellite. It was slow and fragile and eminently useful. It demanded immediate care and immediate decisions. It announced that the world might be salvageable in pieces. When I switched the transmitter on after the raid, because I always turned it on to tell stories, even useless ones, I did something that felt enormous and small at once. I spoke names, I spoke coordinates, and I spoke truth in a voice that had learned to be practical. I told anyone who might hear that there was a line in the mud with a membrane that could be kept working if someone could bring a set of bearings and a spare belt. I did not say how many of us there were or where the child had gone. I offered a map to salvation and left the rest as a choice for whoever called back. The decision to speak felt like opening a wound and letting light in. It could bring help. It could bring wolves. It could also be the thread that knits a small, resilient thing into something larger than our 3 ragged people under a tarp. Outside, the storm pulled itself apart into ragged fingers, and the rain changed from a fist into a hand. The world did not relent, it simply shifted its appetite. We had crossed a line we could not uncross. We had made clean water where there had been none. We had been seen. We had been wounded. We had entered the kind of trouble that sometimes makes history and sometimes makes graves. I wrapped my hands around the jar and felt the coolness seep into my skin. I thought of every small thing that got us here. The bearing that had been taken from Omar's pump, the lie that had held back a man's search, the choice to risk the generator's life for a few minutes of pressure. All of it added up to the turning point. If there was a single verdict the night gave me, it was this. Survival in this weather is not about holding on to what you have. It is about choosing what you will let go of to make room for what can be. I had let go of fuel and safety, and in the calculus, a little of my life. In return, we had a drip of water and a map that might lead us somewhere less brutal. The cost was heavy and immediate, and the reward was modest and mortal. That, I realized, is the kind of choice the world now demands. Morning after the raid felt like walking through the remains of a bonfire. The place smelled of diesel and wet earth, and the iron tang of blood. The teenager's limp had turned into a slow walk. The cut on his thigh had started to swell at the edges, angry and dark. Myra sat with her back against the membrane housing and tapped the rubber with a gentle, absent rhythm, like someone tapping a sleeping friend to make sure they were alive. I held the jar like it was a found relic, warm from our hands and cool from the water, the glass sweating in the cold air. The camp moved differently now. News travels in a different geometry after you prove a thing true. In the first 24 hours after the membrane breathed real water, people came not only in ones and twos, but in cautious clusters. Traders with no visible loyalties. A bearded man who said he could mend bearings if we could provide metal. A woman with a child whose cough sounded like a bell in a dying clock. They came with faces that were careful to hold hope at a distance, as if it were a contagious thing. Some brought barter that mattered. A spool of good wire, a fat leather belt, a handful of bearings scavenged from a sunken commuter train, small miracles packaged in grease. Others brought greed disguised as necessity. Offers to guard the site in exchange for a cut of the water, offers to trade ammunition for parts, and one polite man who suggested we professionalize the distribution, charge a fee and ration on a ledger. I thought of Omar and the ethic he had. If you worked on the pump, you earned a cup. If you hoarded, you were a thief in a ruined world. I felt the old moral judgments as sharp objects rubbing at my ribs. The raiders did not return immediately, but the silence after such a violent night had a shape, watchfulness. We reinforced what we could. Wooden barricades soaked in oil, trip lines that would throw a noise if crossed, a lookout rotation that left no one sleeping for more than a few hours at a time. I taught 2 people how to check seals without depressurizing the housings. Myra taught them how to read the little satellite snippets she kept on her cracked tablet. The teenager learned to steady a wrench with his good leg. We turned the site into a thing with protocols and schedules because civilization is, at its core, protocol, shared habits that keep people alive. There was celebration, quiet and messy. We drank from tin cups and did not speak of the cost. The generator's cough, the last can of diesel burned as bait, the 2 taken by the raiders earlier in the week. We toasted the jar and called it a miracle because that's what our language had left. Miracles are small now. They tasted of pennies and metal and the flush of survival. The cost dug in deeper after the first week. The teenager's cut turned septic despite our cleaning and herbal poultices. We had a bottle of antibiotics enough for 1 course, and I had to decide who would take it. Those choices weigh like currency. I gave it to him because he was the one who could still run, who could still work a pump and climb a tree for fruit. It felt like a pragmatic choice, but pragmatism does not soothe the guilt. I walked alone at dawn and counted the ways the world had asked me to choose. What had shifted inside me was not sudden. It was a slow refining, like metal hammered again and again until the shape changed. Before the raid, I hoarded knowledge like a miser. I understood that the transmitter could kill and save people. After the raid, the choice to speak publicly about the membrane, my decision to broadcast coordinates and needs, felt like a covenant. If I had information that could make a community whole, I owed it out in measured portions. But I also understood the danger of broadcasting like a bell. So I built small checks. I would not give exact coordinates to casual callers. I would verify voices when I could. I would train people to carry the knowledge so the line could survive if the camp did not. That was the other change. I stopped hoarding skill. I taught. In tented corners and during the long, sullen hours of rain, I showed hands how to mate a gasket, how to improvise a pressure tester from a bicycle pump, how to read a pH strip by color under gray light. Teaching someone to mend a pump was not just charity. It was expanding the net that might catch us all when the next collapse came. It felt revolutionary to pass on the small, useful things. Passing on Omar's bearing had been a sin. Passing on the knowledge of how to replace one felt like atonement. Nature didn't repay us for our small technical triumphs. The rain kept falling, patient and corrosive. Fields that had seemed to show a green shoulder after our little roofed gardens had only offered a brittle sprout or 2. The soil was sour in many places. Seedlings died with a sullen, sudden yellowing that looked like shame. Yet in the most sheltered cisterns, behind layers of charcoal and sand, seedlings stubbornly took hold, micro-habitats where we could coax food out of tainted earth. Those pockets were like hope measured in tablespoons. Small, careful, and fiercely defended. The larger ecology gave odd signs, neither promising nor wholly despairing. New lichens clung to rusted girders and seemed to eat the metal's edge with patient indifference. Crows circled overhead in patterns that suggested new migratory logic. A fox, thin and patched with fur missing in places, started to linger near the camp and ignored us as long as we did not move too suddenly. Life adapted in ways that were not always beautiful. Mutation had become a common word in the old science books. In the field it translated to odd plumage, unnerving eyes, and animals that smelled faintly of chemicals. The social environment, however, remained the most volatile. The raiders' retreat the night of the membrane had not been a defeat so much as a negotiation. They had seen the value of our work and decided that bargaining could yield more than brute theft. We traded, we bartered, we conjugated survival into terms both cruel and clever. A guard came to work for us, an ex-raider who wanted a stake that did not involve stealing, and he taught us how raider networks traded information. He spoke of a makeshift council that arranged routes and standards, a crude diplomacy born from hunger and practicality. It made me wonder if the raiders were an anthill reorganizing itself rather than a simple gang. As weeks turned into a month, a pattern emerged. Small hubs of water and skill formed like islands. People moved in chains, one camp trading batteries to another in exchange for a seed packet, which in turn traded labor for a patch of soil. I started mapping these relationships not on Myra's tablet but in my head and on a tattered page in my notebook. The map wasn't of geography so much as of trust. It told me where help might come from and where threats might bloom. My faith in people became more complicated. I found myself judging not only by a person's face, but by the weight of their hands and the steadiness of their answers. I learned to ask questions that revealed character, how they rationed sugar, what they did when someone stole from their camp. Answers told stories. Stories told whether you trusted them with a membrane. The kids changed in ways small and large. The teenager recovered, scarred on one leg, and with a new tenderness in his eyes. He learned to read the sat prints and to mend straps. He also learned to laugh less on the road and more in the safety of the camp. The child with the cough stabilized after a week of clean water and rest. Her mother stayed, trading stories and recipes for poultices. They became the first real family we had in months, a fragile nucleus that reminded me of why we kept trying. There were losses still. I learned that the two we had given up earlier to the raiders had been pressed into service on a road I would never walk. I imagined their hands turning bolts under a different sun, and felt a grief that made me slow to speak of triumph. Triumph is a thin veneer here, prone to cracking. The membrane itself required constant attention. It clogged with colloids and biofilm and demanded periodic backflushing, a tedious massage that took time and parts we did not always have. We learned to stretch the life of each cartridge, a gentle reverse pressure, a careful rinse with saline, periodic charcoal polishing. Every maintenance step taught us patience. Every saved liter reinforced the truth that the world would not heal in one great sweep, but in 1,000 small repairs. On a practical level, the camp was better founded. We organized shifts for patrol and maintenance. We set aside a portion of water for emergencies, and we trained 2 people fully in membrane maintenance so that knowledge would survive any single loss. I altered my broadcasting practice. I still told coordinates, but I layered them with requests and conditions. Who could come with parts, who could offer labor, who would provide watch. My voice on the transmitter became editorial and cautious, and a little more generous. I wanted the world to know what we had, but not to be a beacon for every desperate hand. Most nights I still wound the wristwatch, a useless relic that kept time only for the ritual of winding. It reminded me of human continuity. The rituals mattered as much as the mechanical acts, oiling the generator even when it coughed, checking the filter housing seals at dusk, dragging a tarpaulin over seed trays when a bitter wind came. Ritual anchors people, it anchors me. The world did not heal. The rain continued, the tides rose somewhere I could not see, and the news of collapsing northern settlements came in the static more often than the satellite hum that promised maps. But the small systems we built, our filtration line, the seed trays under plastic, the barter maps, gave us a way to act instead of merely endure. Acting was, in its particular way, a form of hope. Hope, I found, had changed shape for me. It was no longer a cathedral I expected to be built out of rubble. It was a set of practices. Teach someone to seal a gasket, keep a log of flow rates, barter a bearing for a week's worth of labor, tell a lie once to save lives and confess it later. Hope had become operational. When the rain softened to a whisper one evening and a thin smear of sunlight tried to peel through the clouds, the teenager sat with me by the membrane and dipped a grubby finger in the jar. He let the droplet roll over his lips and smiled like someone tasting fruit for the first time. Myra, in the radio room, hummed an old tune she said her mother used to sing. For a moment, the world felt less like a threat and more like something recoverable in increments. I did not pretend that the next storm wouldn't break us or that raiders wouldn't someday come with more men. I didn't pretend that our reservoir of parts wouldn't dwindle, but I did feel a sturdier thing inside me, the conviction that if we could make one membrane work, we could make another. If we could teach 2 people, we could teach 20. If we could stitch a network of microhubs, we might tilt the balance from pure survival to something that looked like rebuilding. The aftermath was not a neat resolution. It was a field of small continuations, of repair and mourning, of trade and watch. It was living with knowledge that every act of generosity had a cost, and every act of secrecy had consequences. It was learning to hold both guilt and gratitude in the same hand. And in that complicated holding, I found a way forward, thin, practical, and stubborn as rust. The jar sits on the ledge of the radio room like a tiny, stubborn sun. It catches the weak light that the clouds concede and throws it back as something usable. I still wake to its presence at dawn, glass sweating, lid threaded just so, and I am surprised every time by the small miracle of clear water. Surprises are rare now, and that rarity makes them holy. You asked me once why I keep talking into the static when the world is full of people who could use the information more than I could. I could offer you a dozen clever answers about networks and redundancy, about the way a single voice can coordinate a convoy and prevent a dozen pointless deaths. The real reason is simpler. Speaking feels like testimony. If nothing else, it records that we were here, that we argued and loved and made choices. The transmitter holds my confession and my recipes and the names I try not to forget. This is the part where I might pretend things have turned a corner. I won't pretend. The rain still comes acid and heavy. The shoreline rumors tell of entire islands folding into the sea. Raiders adapt faster than we can guard. They learn routes and the taste of new engineers. The teenager walks with a limp and a sharper eye for traps. Myra's tablet is a patchwork of hope that needs new batteries and someone who remembers orbital mechanics. The generator coughs less proudly each week. The membrane clogs and we coax rather than expect. And yet, there is a practical, stubborn thread running through the gray. We can make small things last longer if we do them together. That is not a sermon. It is a fact I can show you in receipts. We teach one person to replace a bearing, and you do not lose a water pump when the next storm chews through a shaft. You teach 5 people to seat a gasket, and a supply line survives an armed night raid because it can be rebuilt quickly. In the weeks after the membrane breathed, the camp learned to prioritize. Medical triage first, then pump maintenance, then food. We learned to make a ration that stretched and tasted like ceremony, a spoonful of stew shared, not eaten alone. Hope in our world is a technical thing as much as it is an emotion. It is a cartridge you clean, a belt you mend, a radio frequency you hold tight. It is also the human decisions that make those things worth protecting. Do you share the recipe for neutralizing rainwater? Do you give the location of a pocketed seed bank? Do you teach someone to read a satellite printout? Each decision is a lever, and each lever tips the world a little toward more people living to tell the next story. There are nights, of course, when despair is a tidal thing. It comes in waves. The news that a neighboring camp fell, the day you count the last of a box of antibiotics, the morning when a child with a cough does not wake. Those losses make you hard in places you do not like. They make bargains of you that you do not advertise. But hardness is not only cruelty, it is a preservation of softness in other places. I am harder at the edges so that someone softer, someone with a laugh I want to hear, can be less burdened in the middle. That is a kind of love swaddled in necessity. If I have one practical thing to leave in this voice, one last, usable piece of advice, it is this. Build redundancies. Not in abstract policy terms, but in the small, prosaic ways a town or a tent can survive. Teach someone to sew a gasket from scrap rubber. Keep a list of who can weld, who can read an electrical diagram, who can climb a pole. Store spare belts and a modest cache of fuel for emergencies, and make sure the cache is split and hidden in 3 places. When you find a useful item, don't hoard it like a sin. Ask yourself who else could turn it into a node of resilience and trade the skill to them. Hold knowledge as currency that duplicates itself when spent. There is also a moral part to this I cannot leave unsaid. Your choices are visible. The line between protection and predation is thin and often crossed without malice. When someone begs for a boot to survive a blistered march, remember that denying them may save your stockpile, but will cost you a hand on the day you need allies. When you decide who gets antibiotics, be honest with yourself why you choose the person you do. We are still capable of justice, even if justice looks like a ration list and a watch schedule. People ask me if I am optimistic. I tell them I am operational. There is a difference. Optimism is a large thing. You can buy it in ceramics and in books. To be operational is to make the next act possible. It is to wake at dawn and check seals and teach a teenager how to read a strip of pH paper. It is to understand the small mathematics of survival and to expand the set of people who know that math. The membrane will clog again. The generator will once more cough and demand grace. The raiders will return with new methods and perhaps better weapons. That is likely, and we prepare for it. But between the likely and the fatal, 100 small acts can happen. A bearing found in a sunken train. A trade made with a man who once raided us and now offers his muscle in exchange for meaning. A child taught to read that later reads a list of coordinates and chooses to follow a safer road. Those small acts matter. They are the lever arms of a future that does not yet have a name. I do not close the transmitter at night because I have nowhere to put the stories I carry. I leave it warm, and sometimes, very rarely, a voice answers from the other end. They are faint and often broken, but they remind me that the web of people is not irreparable. A voice says, "We heard you, we're coming," and my chest opens like a door. I tell them what parts we need, what knowledge to bring, where to sleep, and how to behave when they arrive. Those exchanges are fragile covenants, but covenants nonetheless. So here is my plea. If a plea is what you want, keep talking. Share what you know. Teach the person who looks like they cannot learn. Barter your loneliness if it buys a battery that will power a pump. Protect the little systems you build because they are the architecture of any larger repair. And if you must choose between a seed packet and a cartridge, try to choose the one that will keep people living long enough to plant the other. I do not pretend the world will heal overnight, or that we will see the old coastlines return to anything like the maps we once had. But I have seen enough to know that small, deliberate actions can tilt existence from mere survival toward something like life. We are a community of patched things. Patched pumps, patched wrists, patched hearts. That is not a romantic image. It is the nearest thing to salvation I can describe. Tonight the rain is a softer percussion than yesterday. The jar on the ledge has a hairline of condensation, and two worms of light float up from it when I move. The teenager is asleep and dreams of a dog that is not thin. Myra hums under her breath in the next room and counts the uptime of batteries like a litany. I wind the watch because ritual keeps time honest. I oil the zone valves because ritual keeps the future practical. If you hear this, whatever side of the rain you stand on, remember one thing: we keep each other alive by the small work we do and the stories we tell. Stay vigilant. Teach someone what you know. Share your maps and your bearings when you can. And when the night is loud and the world wants you to give up, breathe anyway. There is no promise that tomorrow will be kind, but there is a promise we can make to one another. We will be here. We will keep the pump running. We will pass on the knowledge. Stay alive. Stay human. Keep making the small things that matter.